law is such a credentialist field. We tend to think a couple of things. One is, writing in legal documents, writing in law reviews. This may be really influential. Doing litigation, writing briefs, very influential. All true, all true. But this kind of work matters. This kind of quick hit in public matters. We reach people that law reviews don't reach, and we do it very quickly. Public opinion forms on issues very quickly. We have seen the most astonishing illustration of that fact over the last few weeks when out of nowhere this enormous revolt at police violence and the administration's attitude toward peaceful protest just appeared out of nowhere. So getting stuff out on issues quickly is really very important. And it signals to a lot of people who are out there at their computers or reading their local papers that they're not alone. The progressives are serious people, are thinking and working through these issues, and they are not wrong to be thinking along the same lines. And the other thing, of course, is, it's not a bad thing for your career if you do a good job. If you write a solid, well-researched piece, that can be a career booster. Now, again, and some of this is aimed at people who recently are in law school or have recently graduated. I also do a version of this workshop, though, for law faculties, people who are law professors who want to do more writing for the public. And the important thing for everybody to remember is that, as I say, this is really important work. It is really as valuable as a lot of the other things that you do. And you start from the perspective that my opinion matters. Don't feel credentialed out, okay? And I think we have just had the most wonderful illustration in why you should not feel deference to these august figures who come forth and write these sort of pieces. And that is the meteoric rise and fall of Richard Epstein as an epidemiologist who wrote a piece saying, don't worry, there'll only be 500 deaths from the COVID-19 virus. And when the total reached more than 5,000, a New Yorker reporter called him, and Epstein almost refused to discuss it, but he said, you're just a journalist. Would you like to compare resumes with me? And that's a direct quote. The correct answer, in a very polite way, the journalist said, no, I wouldn't. But the correct answer is screw your resume, right? That's not what this is about. This is about public debate, and your voice matters as much as anybody else. Now, here is something, I talked a little bit at the beginning about my background as a journalist and about Ed Murrow. And I do that in part because I draw on the passion that I felt when I was young for this kind of work and for writing for the public, for getting ideas out there that might not otherwise be given a fair shake. And we are at the end now of a period when people who held progressive views, particularly in the legal area, were a little bit on the defensive. We were on the back foot. There had been a number of very successful rhetorical moves made by people in the conservative legal movement. They were for the rule of law. They were for judges who were principled. We were for just doing whatever you want, and so forth. If you think about the events of the last year, and even more about the events of the last 2 weeks, that paradigm is dead, all right? I don't want to hear a legal conservative talk to me about the rule of law again. I don't want to hear them talk about judges who are principled and originalism, any of that again, because we have gotten a look at what is behind that mask. And it is troops in Lafayette Park, it is police violence, it is the lawlessness of the Trump administration, it is children in cages. And they have shown that they're not just wrong, they are unprincipled. We have no reason to feel defensive. We are right, they are wrong. We are on the move as of this moment. The other side had for a long time a really strong grip on the narrative. All of these largely spurious claims about the principled nature of conservative jurisprudence and so forth. That's over. And we need to step up and fill that void. Now, one of the problems is that law school often discourages students from expressing or even feeling the passion that brought them to law school, the things that drive people throughout their careers. In this line of work, it's useful to rediscover it within the limits we'll talk about. But for right now, the most important thing to remember is don't be apologetic. Don't be intimidated. Don't be afraid. For those of you, my media references age out constantly, but I think most people know what I'm talking about. We are the ones who knock. We are right. They are wrong. And we've got them on the defensive. No apology, no surrender, not one step back. Progressive ideas have a right to be heard and no right to be stifled by a lot of spurious memes. All right, that's in some ways the most important thing I want to tell people to take away from this training. And that's Walter White, who has even less hair than I am, saying, I am the one who knocks. Okay, so let's start with the process of what is an op-ed? How do we sell it? How do we write it? How do we sell it? And I have here on the right a set of qualities. The first is that an op-ed is timely. And I have over here the scene from Citizen Kane where the newspaper has two headlines prepared. One says Kane elected and the other says fraud at polls, Kane defeated. Because we may be seeing some version of this kind of thing in the fall. And if you think about it, just as an example, we know that election problems are coming down the pike at us. It only made sense to expect them. What we've seen in the primaries so far makes clear that they are in the offing somewhere in this country. There will be horrible problems at the polls. There is the possibility that is being raised and discussed by very serious people that the current administration will refuse to recognize the results of an adverse result in November and simply attempt to remain in office. And so if you are thinking, I have passion, I have a reason to want to write something about this if it becomes a problem, you don't have to wait for the problem to occur and then get on, run to the library and look stuff up. You can begin researching the background, the history, wherever you live, if there are potentially local problems, particularly if you're living in a swing state, but also if you're living in a red state. Because voter suppression and election incompetence and trickery are tools of red state governance. You can be ready. You can know the background and the history before election night, and then you will be ready to write about fraud at polls or whatever comes down the line. And newspaper people web journalism people, someone said, should you submit an entire op-ed or a short pitch? I'm glad, and please feel free to jump in with the questions. The answer to that is, I think you should submit the entire piece. I think that the difference between writing a pitch and writing the piece is not going to be that great, assuming you have done the work you need to do to write the piece, right? And all it will do is make your research look vaguer if you boil it down to 300 words. In addition, and I've had this happen to me, your piece may come in through the email on an afternoon when the outlet has nothing to run in a space the next day. And bing, it goes in. Whereas if you're saying, could you get back to me and tell me, that person will say, yeah, after I fill this space tomorrow, right? And you may hear back and you may not. So remember, we're not talking about Finnegan's Wake, that we're talking about pieces that are somewhere between 750 at the short end and 1,500 at the long end. And so, sit down and write it. Now I have another question: how to get others to join your op-ed so that more likely local media will publish. I think that you're asking about getting co-authors. Is that right? Someone says, where do I submit op-eds? Most newspapers have on their website or on their editorial page a general email address for opinion articles. And it is not the same as for letters to the editor. You don't want to submit your piece as a letter, and you want to submit it with a cover saying this is an opposite ed, it is this many words long, and so forth. But you will have to go to the individual page. Now, the other thing you can do if you want to get serious about this where you live is, call up. Ask for names. If you have a friend who works for the paper or a friend who has done it, ask the friend, who did you work with? What is their email? As far as co-authors, all I can think of, I have to say I'm such a strange and grouchy guy that I wrote once a piece co-authored with Dahlia Lithwick because Dahlia Lithwick is such a complete angel that anyone can collaborate with her, but otherwise it's always been me. I think just call people up and call them up in advance, right? Assuming we see something coming down the road, say, I'm thinking of working on this. Would you like to be part of it? I think for myself that 3 is about the most that you can do, because you don't want a kind of committee statement, and neither does the editor. But I'll leave that to you with your knowledge and your contacts with people. Here are the qualities, timely, specific, right? This is not a sort of, I had a friend who wrote a long piece about the neocons. And at the end of it, I said to him, do you realize you have not used the name of a single neoconservative or a direct quote from any neoconservative? You just say the neocons this, the neocons that. I don't think anybody's going to print that. And in fact, no one did. You want to have something in it that's original. Some thought that somebody is going to say, I hadn't thought about that angle. And another reason to be thinking ahead. What do you care about? Even if it's not something that's predictable like the election, what do you care about? What are you passionate about? Think about what's not being said in the dialogue now, and begin to think of how you could shape that in reaction to news. Complete means, it is really the difference between an opinion piece and a letter to the editor, which is, your piece has a beginning, middle, and an end. It has a complete argument. It really attempts to cover at least one aspect of the problem you're talking about in a way that is not just sort of partial. Um, you need to be correct. You need to be making specific factual assertions that you have backed up and checked by research. And here we have Alan says he agrees that think ahead and explain at least a facet of a timely issue, and I'm glad. I think that is right. And again, I say, you can. I mean, one thing we know, for example, just here's one way to do it, right? Is that we're coming up. President Trump has educated a lot of us. We're coming up on Juneteenth, and we're coming up on the 99th anniversary of the Tulsa massacre. And anniversaries become very important times to talk about, how the period we're living through relates to that history. On June 10th, 1964, the United States Senate, by a 2/3 vote, adopted the Civil Rights Act, or broke the filibuster of the Civil Rights Act, something. So anniversaries are important too. But also, if you know enough about a subject to have an opinion, you're going to know that it's coming. Don't know when, and just be ready, right? Research, it needs to be the correct length. One mistake a lot of people make is they write a piece that is a length either too long or too short that the outlet they're aiming at doesn't print. And the editor knows when he or she looks at your submission, this person doesn't know much about us. So make sure you study the places you want to place, and you know the parameters. Don't proofread, don't make typos. And document it. Be prepared to back up your statements if you're asked about them. So what is an op-ed? Okay, this is probably the money shot of this talk, and it's the parts. It's literally the anatomy. An op-ed consists of an interesting lead, and notice that in the business we spell lead L-E-D-E, and that is because that establishes that we're not like regular people. We're very cool. I can't think of any other reason why it's spelled that way, but I guarantee you it is. So you start with an interesting lead. We'll look in more detail at that. Then you explain why your op-ed and what you want to discuss is relevant to the news now, right? Because you are placing this in a news medium. Sometimes they run essays on things like, love and loss and marriage, but you probably are aiming at something that's happening in the news, and you have to explain, here's why. The third thing, and this is very important, we'll take a really close look at it, is what I call the claim of authority. Why are you the person to write an op-ed on this, and why should readers take time? People are just smothered with content these days. Why should people give? I noticed that the outlet I write for, The Atlantic, will put a thing on their homepage that lists an article and will tell you how many minutes it takes to read, because they are dealing with this problem of busy eyeballs. I have to say I'm always deeply depressed when I see how few minutes they expect my readers to give to my well-reasoned positions, but that's probably ungracious on my part. Prolepsis, we'll look at that again, but that is basically fair argumentation. You tell people, you share with people what the other side thinks specifically. And remember my friend with the neocons, he just will characterize the neocons, didn't quote them, didn't let anybody know who they are. You're specific, and then you refute it in a fair and reasonable way. You say, here's why they are wrong. You don't say, they are idiots. Or you don't say, of course they do, they work for the Koch Foundation, or anything like that, right? You refute it with facts and reasoning. You conclude with something that the readers could do, and then go back, loop back to the lead. And I'll show you how that works in the next slide. So the lead is really important. And honestly, if the lead is bad, the editor won't even read the rest. I wish that were not true, but it is. So here's a poor lead, one that I wrote when I was contemplating writing a piece, a very angry piece, and I was trying to keep my anger under control. The recent controversy over executive nominations by Governor Kitzhaber raises important questions. And when I sat down to work more and read over that first paragraph, I didn't even want to go on. I bored myself. So here is a second try at that. And it makes a little clearer why it's me who is interested in this, but it's pretty direct. It's better. The Republican majority in the Oregon Senate blocked my nomination to the Crime Commission. Here's why that matters. And the second part is to say, I'm not just kvetching, it matters to you. Now, here is what I finally came up with. This is a paraphrase. And I was able to place the piece in the biggest newspaper in the state. When I read in the newspaper that the Oregon Senate had rejected my Uncle George for the Crime Commission, I was surprised. George has been dead since 1958. He spent his career as Lodge Secretary of the Richmond, Virginia Elks. Only later did I realize they had gotten my name wrong and voted me down without even knowing who I am. And that was true. I didn't make this up. Question, will I be sharing this PowerPoint with the attendees? Yes. I have sent it to Lindsay. And I think she's going to put it on the web somewhere, okay? And there is also a written material next to it, also called Anatomy of an Op-Ed, that has full-length examples of this and some work that other people have done. So relevance, why are we reading about this today? This is a piece that I placed before I went to law school. And it begins with a narrative lead that tells the story of my personally witnessing a young 18-year-old black man who wanted to vote, his first vote for Jimmy Carter, and was intimidated away from the polls by a white registrar who kept saying, do you know the FBI investigates voter fraud? And one of the reasons I wanted to go to law school was that I felt so helpless watching this man's vote be literally suppressed in front of my eyes. So I tell that story, and then why am I reading about this today? And the answer is Bill Rehnquist has been nominated for Chief Justice, and he had been in the testimony in front of the committee identified as someone who in Arizona stood at the polls as part of a Republican Party effort to harass Black and Hispanic voters. And he would go up and say, can you read, show me, read this card. I want to see your documents. Are you a citizen? One witness claimed there had actually been a sort of physical altercation that Rehnquist took part in. It's hard for me to imagine Rehnquist throwing much of a punch, but I may be underestimating the man. That's why we're reading about it now, okay? Then the question is the claim of authority. Why should you care what I think? And that sounds like pomposity, but it's not. It's literally just an answer to that question. It's probably the most important single thing in selling an op-ed. If you just, I had a friend who sent me an op-ed that described sitting and watching or reading Tom Cotton's op-ed. And it was, very well put, but the fact of the matter is everybody read Tom Cotton's op-ed. The question is, why should we buy an op-ed from you, okay? And it doesn't have to be, academic qualifications, right? I grew up a few blocks from the Lee Monument in Richmond. That's a piece that I did. I'm proud to say 2 years ago saying, let's take the goddamn statues down. And here's this is someone else. I have written things like this. I spent 4 years playing basketball with the Stonewall Jackson High School Raiders, right? That gives the person some moral authority to talk about what it's like to have to carry Confederate iconography around on you. But it could also be your academic or professional qualifications as a historian, as an accountant, as an economist, as a construction worker. People know things. You know things. You don't need necessarily an academic credential. And then things you experienced in your work. So I had a student who actually showed up to intern for the Southern Poverty Law Center on the day that Roy Moore put the 10 Commandments in the Alabama Capitol, and he was there for the entire trial injunction on that and was able to write some very interesting stuff. He was not even a law graduate at that point, but he was there. He had seen it. He knew what it was like, and people were very curious about that. Now, there's also what I call rhetorical authority, and that is drawn, the reason I use the term rhetorical is it's really drawn from Aristotle. And that means why should you care what I think? You don't know me. We've never met. And Aristotle said there are three parts of a rhetorical presentation. Will information about CLE for the main session and breakout be posted? Are these separate links and passwords? Please clarify. It's my understanding that there will be a link for this session on the chat, and that the password is Jessica, all caps. If that's wrong, maybe Will could or Charlie could. Yeah. So stay on the chat. You can mute me if you want. That's fine, but stay on that chat. And there are three parts of the rhetorical appeal in what Aristotle called forensic or argumentative writing. And the first is the logos, and that's your facts and your arguments and the logic you use, right? Those are important, but they're not the only thing. The second thing is to say the ethos. And what that means is I'm a person that you would like. I'm a person that you would respect. I'm serious. I'm open-minded. I'm fair. I have thought hard about these things. I'm not just reflexively saying something, and I'm not trying to argue something because it's my advantage. You want to think what I think because someone like me thinks it. And you don't say that, but it's very important in the way you present yourself. And then pathos, right? Sometimes we're writing about issues that may seem abstruse to people, but I feel strongly about them, you say, and here's why you should. There is, these abstract issues touch our lives in ways that we don't even fully recognize, and they can cause serious pain and hardship for people. And I care about that, and I think you should care about it too. So those are the three parts of the rhetorical authority. So once you've made that claim, live up to it. Do your research. Do not read an article in the paper and then sit down and write an op-ed in response to that. For one thing, the papers sometimes get it wrong. They tell the story wrong. They have the facts wrong. For another thing, nobody needs your op-ed. They can read the paper. We are in the golden age of online research. We are in a world that I could only dream of for most of my career, where you can sit down. I'm in lockdown, but I can get every government report that I want. I can get every hearing transcript that I want. I can get back issues of magazines, foreign coverage, cases. I can read the briefs in Supreme Court cases and the transcripts of oral argument just sitting in my study. So do that. Get the material that you need so that you really are sure that your statements are factual, and fact check every factual statement, right? And that is, I get in trouble. I make factual mistakes. I'm sort of like Norris the butler in The Big Sleep, who says, "Yes, sir, I make many mistakes." But usually the mistakes that I make are on statements that I think are so obvious that I don't need to check them. And that often can be dates, it can be who said something, it can be the words they used. Check everything. Check the day of the week that something happened on. Even the things that seem obvious can go awry. You don't want the newspaper to be fact-checking and find out you're wrong, and even worse, to publish what you've written and then have somebody write in and say, well, this person doesn't know what he or she is talking about, because actually the facts are such and such. I've got a comment here from Alan who says, recognize your pertinent adjacent experience. I've practiced very little criminal law, but a lot of civil law. I did a ton of investigative work, usually in the form of discovery. And that's a really good point, right? You don't pose as a criminal attorney, but you say, the work that lawyers do is very similar. And here are my experiences. Alan again says, find experts and consult them. That's a really good thing to do. Maybe you can even line up some in advance, so you're not, if you have to do something in a hurry, they know who you are. Proleptical argument, I mentioned this before, I think is very important. And that is, you make your argument in calm, non-polemical language. I get it that at present we are arguing against people who do it a different way. People who call us Antifa, snowflakes, or whatever. That's not the point, because you're not writing to answer them. You are writing to reach people who are not like them. And that's the majority. We can see that in the reaction to the current protests. There are people out there who really have tremendous reservoirs of decency, openness, want to learn, want to know about things. And if you come at them with a lot of jargon, if you come at them sneering at the other side, calling them names, suggesting that they're, acting only out of financial self-interest and so forth, you lose them. I remember reading a piece years ago by a labor economist who worked at a pro-labor think tank. And, I'm an old shop steward, so I'm pro-labor. But he was disputing some claims that had been made by a man who was Secretary of State. Now, at that time, I was living in Oregon, which is about the size of the metro area. So, the DC metro area, everybody knows everybody. And I knew the Secretary of State, a perfectly decent guy. I didn't agree with him on some things. And the labor economist says, so-and-so claims such and such, but he is just carrying water for the tech industry. And I put the piece down. Okay, I'm pro-labor. I'm an old union man. But I just don't want to hear that. I want, if you think someone's wrong, say why they're wrong. Don't sneer, don't belittle, don't use derogatory nicknames. You're not Donald Trump. The people don't like it. So refute the other side's argument fairly. And that's why it's important to go back to Walter White. You can do it because we're right. Don't write like a lawyer. I mean, we all know that we shouldn't, but it's hard to do it. And one of the things that I think has been really valuable for me is that I spent a number of years as a science writer for various publications, and trying to explain scientific concepts to non-scientists in print is very challenging. You have to use metaphors. You can't sort of say, amphiblast clones do such and such. People have no idea what you're talking about. So that is a useful, the construction of metaphors like that is a useful technique. And this first example is something that one of my students in my legal nonfiction seminar came up with this spring. Standing might be called the house on fire principle. If the fire isn't in your house, you don't have standing. That's, not an answer. You wouldn't write that in a brief. You wouldn't submit it to a court, but it lets people understand what the court is talking about if we're writing about a standing decision. The most important rule of writing I ever learned, and I learned this from the late Ted Bernstein, who was a editor at the New York Times and wrote some absolutely wonderful books. One called Watch Your Language, which is about how to write clearly. And when I see today's New York Times and how far they have wandered from Ted Bernstein's precepts. It makes me very sad. But this is his most important rule: one thought per sentence. Lawyers don't write that way. You haven't been trained to write that way. You're trying to pack all the correct nuance into one sentence, and you're writing for an audience, a judge or another lawyer or an administrative tribunal or a government body that is, that reads, that understands, that can read long sentences and put them down, put them together in their minds. Ordinary readers can't do that, and they don't want to. So when you have to explain 3 legal concepts, think about 3 sentences. Because if you try to jam it all together, you will lose people. One thought per sentence. My students get really tired of this. I write in big red letters on their papers, OTPS, exclamation point. And, they hate it. When an idea is complicated or surprising, let the readers know when that you understand, right? And here's a few that have come across my desk lately. This is from an article about climate change litigation. The idea that the Constitution protects the climate seems like a new idea. But the fact of the matter is, the theory of the lawsuits where this piece is about are based on the public trust doctrine. You don't immediately say, but there's the public trust doctrine, because you're still dealing with the idea that the idea that the Constitution protects the climate. You're trying to tell people about that. So you say, look, this idea has a venerable history in areas like natural resources and federal Indian law. And the next sentence would be, in those contexts, it is called the public trust doctrine. And then you explain what that means. One thought per sentence, and you signal. One of the things, when I lived in North Carolina, and I went to law school in North Carolina at a time when former Senator John Edwards was probably the most sort of dynamic plaintiff's lawyer in the state. And when people heard that Edwards was giving closing arguments to a jury, the seats in the courthouse would fill up with other lawyers who wanted to see why he was so successful with them. And one of the techniques that Edwards used is so simple that it seems sort of trivial, and yet people don't do it. And that was, he would be talking along about the case, usually these big product liability cases that involve complicated issues of causation and so forth. And he would say, at a certain point, he'd lay out, this chain of events, and then he'd stop and he'd say, now I want everyone to pay close attention here, because this is real important. And, people in the jury box would sort of sit up and sort of say, okay, Mr. Edwards wants us to pay attention. You signal to people, this is an important concept you're about to learn. This is something that's new. This is something that's going to surprise you. Signal. We're done talking about X. We're now going to talk about Y, right? Here, another example of how to do these complex terms is this definition of stare decisis. Courts should not flip-flop back and forth on given issues. Even if judges don't like precedent, they are usually required to observe it. Well, that tells people something about stare decisis, and certainly moves it from the Latin and law French category into English as is spoken in this country. End up saying in your piece, what should happen now? What needs to happen now? Congress needs to act, and readers need to contact them, and they need to say, here's what you need to say when you call your member of Congress. Is there a bill pending, or does Congress need to hold hearings, or does the DA need to investigate? How can we help? People, who have been persuaded want to help, and this is your chance to reach them. And then finally, you come out with a conclusion where you say, we've learned such and such, right? And then loop back to the beginning, loop back to your lead, so that people feel they have been presented with something complete. So the last sentence of my article about the Republican smear machine and their attack on Democratic appointees in the Oregon legislature was referring back to the thing at the beginning about my Uncle George. If they can make some kind of liberal menace out of my poor dead Uncle George, they can smear you or anybody else, right? So it matters. The next question, of course, is placing an op-ed. And those of you of a certain age will recognize Lou Grant, who was kind of the archetypal newspaper editor when I was a young journalist. Lou Grant, I mean, it's Ed Asner, obviously, but he played a character named Lou Grant on the Mary Tyler Moore Show, who was always sort of telling Mary that she was completely wrong about everything, and she had to find a way to get around him. And he is saying the words that you don't want to hear from an editor, which can be summarized or abbreviated, MIGO. And that's my eyes glaze over, right? I read the first paragraph. I'm not interested. That doesn't float my boat. That's what I had an editor used to say that all the time with great ideas. That doesn't float my boat. So you want to avoid that. That's one reason you need a good lead. The second is you need to place the op-ed soon, hours, not days, certainly not weeks, soon, as quickly as possible. You need to submit the entire thing. I feel really strongly about it. Thanks, Professor Herbert. I really appreciate it. Don't ever turn it in longer than that outlet likes and say, I'll be glad to cut it. The editors, weird as this sounds, editors aren't there to edit, right? They're there to put stuff in or throw stuff out, and they'll just throw your stuff out. Don't use footnotes, don't use legal citation. It takes me half a semester to convince my legal nonfiction students not to put inline citations in their nonfiction pieces, so they'll say, as we learned in Mapp versus Ohio, 27 U.S. 46. Like, nobody reads 27 U.S. 46, right? Not even the people that expect you to put it in, but you certainly don't do that in something written for the public. When you are submitting an op-ed, introduce yourself. It says, do you have a name to drop? That means, do you know someone who has dealt with the editor, as a friend of the editor before? It doesn't mean, I met Norman Mailer once, though I did, I have to say. But tell them who you are, what are your, what's your background, why you want to write about this, why they should buy your piece, what it says that is not, the standard thing that they're going to get either from, some their usual contributors or Bloomberg Opinion or something else. As you do this, you will begin to build up clips. And then you can say, I've had pieces published in such and such and such. Explain the relevance. Don't assume the editor knows why something's relevant. The editor has got a zillion things on his or her mind. No legal jargon. Editors hate that. Even editors who went to law school probably end up in editing because they don't want to hear any more legal jargon. So they don't like it. When you're starting out, it's best to submit it to one outlet at a time. And, if you don't hear from them in a day or two, you can say, this is time pegged. Should I send it somewhere else? But, an editor who puts time into something and then has you write to say, so-and-so other place bought it, is like, well, thanks for wasting my time. I won't read your piece next time. And that honestly is what they think. You don't necessarily get a quick response, depending on how timely a piece is. Editors usually don't ask for rewrites. They may say, we want to do it and we'll edit it. Usually you don't get a chance to do a full rewrite. And you don't get a lot of feedback. It's like, yeah, we want your piece. We want to run it Tuesday, right? What do publications pay for an op-ed? Well, there's the bad news. The bad news is that a lot of places pay nothing, right? You can, as you move yourself up the food chain, you may be looking at $175, $100, 150. I know the Atlantic will pay, 200 or something like that. But these are labors of love by and large. Do I see similar value in social media posts? Well, I certainly see some value in social media posts. And if you have unique knowledge about a subject, posting a thread that is carefully written, contains useful links, is calm and so forth, really can reach a lot of people. I guess Facebook posts do too. I am old enough to remember when Facebook friend meant the person was your friend. And so when I see somebody post a long essay on Facebook, I'm sort of like, no, I'm not going to read this because I'm looking for my friends. But I know Facebook posts do get a lot of reading, and they get shared by people and so forth. And I also think that, on these issues that we care about, getting our ideas out there, if it can't be in the New York Times, in your local paper. If it can't be in your local paper, in your local news website. If it can't be in the local news website, on Twitter. But get that out there, because people read this stuff and they say, look, somebody else who's smart, somebody else who's thought about these things, somebody just like me agrees with me. There's nothing wrong with me to think this, right? And we can, if we are careful and aggressive and ethical, as I said at the beginning, we are the ones who knock. So get out there and knock. If there are any questions, be glad to take one or two. If not, I'll turn you over to the cat. All right. Thank you all so much for your indulgence. It's always a pleasure to do things for ACS, and thank you for supporting the American Constitution Society. What we're doing is more important than ever, and let's keep it up because we're going to win.